cried out, Mila Hashem Elai, and that was the battle cry for the revolt. But honestly, it's hard to know whether Matityahu thought anything would come of this. What Matityahu realized at that moment was that as a Jew in Eretz Yisrael at that time, it seemed to be only two choices. You could either live as a Greek, as a Goy, and do whatever they wanted you to do, or you could die as a Jew. But you couldn't, there was no other option. You couldn't live as a Jew. If you wanted to keep Shabbat, they would kill you. If you did a Brit Milah for your son, they'd find the son and the mother and kill them both, etc., etc. So he probably felt, if that's the situation, I'd rather die as a Jew. So there's nothing to lose, really. Probably the Maccabim and the Jews in general were more surprised than the Greeks at their success over a period of time. It didn't happen overnight, it should be clear. We're not talking about a little skirmish that took place one day in the afternoon and it was all over in 2 hours and the Jews won and everyone lived happily ever after. That's not how it worked. This was the beginning of a revolt, of a guerrilla campaign against a very professional and large army, which included armored elephants, which in those days was like a tank. It was a very powerful weapon. The Jews had never seen such things. This went on for years. It took a number of years until they were able to drive all Greek forces out of the country. And all of a sudden the Jews found themselves, and no one had planned this, it has to be absolutely clear, no one planned this. They knew they were fighting to be Jews. They hadn't really thought about being a Mamlechet Kohanim v'Goy Kadosh. But all of a sudden, the opportunity presents itself. Well, we're here in Eretz Yisrael, here we are, and the Greeks have run away, at least for now, because they came back, unfortunately. So it was a short-lived victory, nevertheless, but it was of very great historical significance. Because let there be no doubt in your minds, were it not for the events of Hanukkah, I do not believe we would be sitting here discussing anything to do with Judaism or with Torah, because there wouldn't be Judaism, there wouldn't be a Torah. That event, that revolt, saved Judaism from oblivion. Had the Jewish presence in Eretz Yisrael been forcibly divorced from its traditions, from the Torah, from the way of life of their forefathers, then the Jews in the diaspora and the Galut also would have gone the same way. Without that national focal point in Eretz Yisrael, even though it was a relatively small number of Jews, but it served nevertheless as a focal point for all the Jews in the world. And the Torah, the study of Torah, etc., had not really developed to such an extent in the Galut at that point. Only at a later time was the study of Torah and Jewish practice very, very well rooted in the reality of the exile. So Hanukkah saved the Jewish people and saved Torah Judaism. And all of a sudden the Jews were there in Eretz Yisrael. They even had a fighting force which had defeated the Greeks on a number of occasions. And lo and behold, they were independent, they were free. They could now be a sovereign nation. They hadn't even thought about it, and it's quite clear from the description as it appears in, for instance, in the book of the Maccabees, that they really hadn't thought about this. They hadn't planned for this, and it took them by surprise. So they began to make some arrangements and to organize some form of government, etc. And in fact, that grew into what's known as Malchut Bet Hashmonai, the Hasmonean kingdom or dynasty, which lasted for about 3 or so generations, 3-4 generations, and that also eventually ended. In other words, there was a brief period of Jewish independence in the land of Israel as a result of these events, brief in the historical sense. The Rambam actually writes about this, and he says that the Jewish people were independent in their land as a result of the events of Hanukkah for 200 years. B'mehilat kevodo shel Rambam, that's not exactly historically accurate. The Rambam didn't have historical sources that we have. he bases that statement on one source which is wildly inaccurate, called Megillat Antiochus, which we have both in Hebrew and Aramaic, and there that figure of 200 years appears. It's true, but we know that it was only really about 100 years, because after 100 years the Romans already entered the picture. The Romans entered the country, and it's also necessary for me to tell you in passing why the Romans entered the picture. There were two brothers, sons of Yanai Melech. We spoke about Sinat Hinam, remember, before? We spoke about politics, we spoke about everyone wanting power and the nation being fractured and divided. Well, here's a piece of information, which, by the way, Chazal do tell us. Chazal do speak about this. It appears in the Talmud, it appears in Midrashim. King Yanai had two sons, one whose name was Polkanos, and the other one was Aristobulus. You can already hear from the names that these are not really Jewish names. They were fairly assimilated, but they were Jews, and it was a sovereign Jewish country, and that's something of great value. It's something, if you want to know why that's something of great value, I'll talk about that in a moment. But I'm saying, for the record, I'm stating a fact that when you have a Jewish state, any Jewish state, that's better than no Jewish state. A whole lot better. And they were fighting over who would be king. They had a civil war about it. No one wanted to give up. Why should you? I mean, it's only the Jewish people's future at stake here. You're much more important than that, obviously. So they had a civil war, and when one side saw that things weren't going too well for him, he called on the Romans to come and help. Come and help me bring in some soldiers and help me defeat my brother. And then of course, the payback is that I'll essentially will become a vassal state. And that's what happened. So, you see again a perfect example of Sinat Hinam, politics, power politics, all the wonderful things we spoke about before. There you have it right there before you, a real historical fact. That's how the Romans came to the country in 66 BCE. So, the Jewish people had this unexpected high point in the Second Temple period, the time of Hanukkah and the events that followed. And if there was any time when you may have thought that now the Jews will actually realize that we've been, sitting around waiting for something to happen for a long time, now it's happened. Something great has happened, something that's never happened before, not in centuries, let's do something. Unfortunately, that didn't happen either. So the highest point became the great event of Hanukkah became a very great disappointment. And therefore I repeat that the entire period of Beit Sheni, including the events of Hanukkah, to a large extent the gains were squandered very quickly. That whole thing is a tremendous missed opportunity. And this is something we have to recall as we celebrate Hanukkah. We celebrate the great victories, the great bravery, the courage of our forefathers who fought against our enemies who wished to eradicate Judaism and the Jewish people as a separate nation, a nation with a special purpose. They were able to defeat these people quite miraculously, in the sense that it was, in the same sense that the Six-Day War was miraculous. There was actually no supernatural miracle there, but it's a miraculous event. It's not the norm. The word nes, by the way, in Hebrew doesn't always mean a miracle. It's misunderstood. It does mean miracle, but it also means an outstanding event. We see this in the Gemara in Masechet Arachim, Daf Yod Aleph. It says there, it talks about Hallel, why we say Hallel. And explains, the Gemara explains, we say Hallel on a day which is called a Mo'ed, on a day where it's asur to do Melacha min HaTorah, there's a prohibition from the Torah to do Melacha, like Shabbat, Yom Tov, but on Shabbat, no, it has to be called a Mo'ed. It has to be a day with a special Korban Musaf, it has to be a day when there's Nisur Melacha, and only on days that come about occasionally, not on a regular basis. So Shabbat is not included. So we say Hallel on the first day of Pesach. We say Hallel on Shavuot. We say Hallel for 8 days of Sukkot. And then the Gemara asks, what about Hanukkah? Why do we say Hallel on Hanukkah? Because Hanukkah is not a festival, not a Hag from the Torah. There's no Korban Musaf. There's no Isur Melacha. You're allowed to do Melacha on Hanukkah. It's like a weekday. It's not called a Mo'ed in the Torah, obviously. It's not mentioned in the Torah. So why do you say Hallel on Hanukkah? The Gemara says, because of the Nes, Mishum Nisa. And here again, many people misunderstand what's being said. Many people would say, it's talking about a miracle. It's talking about the miracle of some oil burning for longer than expected. That's what the whole thing of Hanukkah is about in the eyes of many people. That's why we celebrate Hanukkah, because a certain quantity of oil that was expected to last so long lasted quite a bit longer. If you like, we can talk about that a bit more in a few moments. But the Gemara continues and says, okay, if that's the case, why don't we say Hallel on Purim? We don't say Hallel on Purim. The Gemara has to explain, and the Gemara says that there was a Nes at Purim also, so why don't we say Hallel at the time of Purim? And the Gemara says, well, that was because it took place in Chutz La'aretz, in the Galut. And that means to say that it's not therefore a very significant event in the bigger scheme of things of Jewish history, because all it means is that the Jews were in Galut, they were in danger of being eradicated. That danger was somehow removed, and the Jews now can continue doing what? Continue being where they were before. In other words, they're not where they want to be, where they should be. So it's just a reprieve from a death sentence, but it's not. It hasn't changed the reality on the ground. And therefore, the Gemara said we don't say Hallel on Purim. Instead, we read the Megillah. But if you note what the Gemara says, you see something very interesting. The Gemara says, regarding Chanukah, we say Hallel because of the Nes. A lot of people say, the Nes is referring to the oil. But then it says about Purim, it says, well, why don't we say Hallel for Purim, because there was a Nes on Purim as well. Well, ask yourself, what Nes was there on Purim? What miracle, what supernatural event took place at the time of Purim? Does anyone know? I don't know. I've read the Megillah a number of times. It's not there. In fact, not even the name of Hashem appears in the Megillah, as we all know. Purim is a chain of events related, as we see it in the Megillah, a chain of normal events, normal in the sense that there's nothing supernatural about them. What's interesting is the way they work together, the synergy between those events, the way one thing leads to another, and seeming coincidences, etc., which we know are not coincidences, but there's nothing supernatural there. And the lesson of Purim, therefore, is that Hashem is able to determine the outcome of events even without you seeing it before your eyes, as though his hand doesn't come down and move things around. He does it without you seeing. That's the message of Purim. But the Gemara says there was a Nes. What's the Nes? There was no Nes. It wasn't even oil. So where's the Nes? So you have to understand, you're forced to understand that the word Nes is often used by the Chachamim, and also the Tanakh, by the way. There's a pasuk in Tehillim, Natata le're'echa nes le'hitnoses. You have given a banner for your followers to hold on to look up to. The word nes really means a banner. What is a banner? Like a military banner, a flag of some kind. It's something that you see from afar, something that sticks out because it's higher than the things around it. And maybe it's a bright color or something, you see it from afar, correct? A nes is something which stands out, something unusual. That is what the word means. And therefore it's used to also mean a miracle, something supernatural, because something supernatural stands out. It's not in the nature of things. But essentially the word nes can refer to any outstanding event. And therefore Purim is an outstanding event without there being anything supernatural about it. And Hanukkah is a nes without there being anything supernatural about it. Because it's the essential nes that's being referred to in that Gemara there is not the oil. That's not a reason to say that's not a reason to recite Hallel, as the Marami Prague points out at the end of his book, Ner Miswa, on Hanukkah. He says if it was all just about the oil, we wouldn't have Hanukkah, we wouldn't celebrate for 8 days, we wouldn't say Hallel for 8 days. That's not a reason to say Hallel. We all know that Hashem can do things against the laws of nature. And therefore the fact that this amount of oil burnt for longer than usual is something that we understand. It's not certainly, maybe even if it's supernatural, it's not outstanding in the sense that we have to talk about it for 2,000 years. And therefore, the Nes being referred to in the Gemara in the Masechet Arachim, why we say Hallel, is the events of the revolt, the uprising, and the victories against our enemies, which were quite miraculous. And as I said before, in the same sense that the Six-Day War was miraculous, or the War of Independence was also miraculous, etc.